Well, I feel quite privileged going last because Juliana has set the scene for the workers that I'm talking about and explained the similar demographics around age and education. And Eleonora has talked about the work-life balance and the pressure of time, and Lisa has represented the progressive Australians, at least, commitment to truth, treaty and voice. So there we go, women organising women, and we didn't even need to have hours and hours of planning to do it. We just did it ourselves. So thanks, folks. My presentation today is from a trade union perspective and how trade unions might organise their internal structures and processes of institutional decision making to organise these precarious workers. And this quote from one of my interviewees, and I'll let you guess what that little star in that second last word on the first line might be in English. But if you don't know where the members are in the workforce, how do you organise these disability support workers? And we have a system where we have a public sector workforce that's quite organised, one employer employed by the state government, or the state government is the one employer. Yet we also have a large not-for-profit sector, also called, perhaps in the international vernacular, non-government organisations. We call them NFPs, and it's these workers that there is very weak unionisation rates amongst. So what I want to do today is think about what are some of those institutional and organisational factors that contribute to this poor rate of unionisation, and what unions may be able to do to alleviate that, or to indeed organise these members. So these are the questions that I'm posing. This is out of whack. Okay. All right. So we have really an existing problem with an emerging problem. So the existing problem we have around trade unions in Australia is their lack of organising in a particular area, and the emerging problem is the shift to digital platforms and greater fracturing of the workplace. So what are unions going to do to assist themselves, or to organise workers in these circumstances? Now, the issue, there are a couple of things that need clarification here. The Australian industrial relations system is quite unique. We've had it for, we had a system from the 1900s that lasted for about 80 years. It's a system of a union can register and it has rights to organise in the workplace. So we don't have that need to vote and to organise in a workplace. We just register, exist. There's then a level of codification of workers or unions and employers in the workplace. So that was one good thing about unions can just exist, but how do they exist? And when unions were formed in the early 1900s, there were a couple of significant decisions that emerged and have really set the conditions as to how unions operate still today. The first was this very early minimum wage decision, and what that did was fantastic, provided a minimum wage for poor people, but it set the wage as a male to support his wife and 3 children. So there wasn't an equivalent woman to support her husband and 3 children, and women had only about 50% of the male's wage. So they were doing the same work, had a much lower wage, and this has continued on and of course created some sectoral and occupational discrimination, which we're still dealing with today. We also have these things called awards, which are effectively contracts of employment. And of course, they were negotiated around this pre-war period, pre-World War II, in between the wars, I guess. And of course, they were negotiated by people who were at the table. And that was men in unions, men in workplaces, men as judges. So the idea of particularly care work, childcare, disability, aged care, that was women's work. So it didn't ever have an industrial value, even though the institution is set up to have an industrial value. And in the 1990s, we very rapidly went to workplace bargaining. And if you didn't have an established union structure, which women's workplaces didn't, it was very difficult then to translate any form of unionisation and improvement of women's rights into the workplace. But we also know from the photographs that I have here that radical women exist. They have been fighting for equal pay and equal rights in the workplace for a long time. So, why are we still searching for better conditions of employment? So what I want to experiment here with is some new notions around why unions might struggle to organise these not-for-profit workers. And one theme, one explanation is path dependency. And when we talk about path dependency, we're talking about what we've done before worked okay, we'll continue to do it. So there's not a lazy approach to doing it, just replicating what we're doing. It's just that we haven't hit a critical juncture. And unions, if they do hit a critical juncture, something massive happens, we know that they can change. So this is one explanation, is perhaps path dependency is the reason why unions haven't really moved to organise these workers. The second set of explanations there is a lot tighter in terms of lock-in, and that's a very structured way that organisations function. So we have three levels there: functional, which really is referring to the institution. So what we had in 1905, the Commonwealth Court of Conciliation, Arbitration and Conciliation, is now called the Fair Work Commission. So it still exists. The laws are much weaker after decades of neoliberalism, but nevertheless, that institution still exists as an important part of the functioning of our industrial relations system. Then we have cognitive features, which are the norms and decisions and rules and conventions that we've used and have always used. And so if we get locked into those, how do we break away to organise people who haven't had the same sort of experiences? And then we have political features of lock-in. And that's a very active way of preserving the structures, the institutional structures and relationships. So they can be so deeply embedded that they can really obstruct any political innovation when you're trying to set up new forms of power, new union discussions, new union narratives. So the question here for us is, as trade unions, if we preserve those institutional structures and maintain those power relationships, what does it mean for organising these underrepresented workers? So the evidence that I'll just go into, and it's from my PhD, semi-structured interviews, fairly conventional ways. These are quotes from trade union officials. There was a reasonable gender split in the trade union officials, but interestingly, in the state of Victoria, it's about the size of Switzerland. All of the organisers were based in the city, but a lot of the care happens in all over the place. So what are the unions? Union 1, well, they work in similar areas. Really, the important point here is that they both recognise that the potential growth for union membership is in the not-for-profit sector, and they both have self-report very high rates of membership in the public sector, so very low rates in the area that we're talking about. So in terms of organisational structures, if we're thinking about path dependency and lock-in, what does the evidence tell us? Well, in Union 1, they acknowledge that the workforces, public sector and not-for-profit, about the same. But if you go across to the right-hand column, you can see they have one organiser for the area where the workers are, and 6 organisers for the area where the growth in the membership is not. But that's where the comfort zone is because they're public sector. Union 2, different. They have managed to get the same number of internal people through arguments within the union. So there's had some experimentation there to cover the workers. That is also the greatest level of growth opportunities for the union. In terms of their institutional responses, thinking about the lock-in again, those functional, particularly the functional areas, these unions both talk about using bargaining as a way, as celebrating growth in members. Okay, that's great, but it only happens every couple of years. And our bargaining structure is broken, and we're having arguments now about how to fix it. But if you're only doing that, if you're only looking at members growing members every couple of years, what are you doing in the meantime? How are you maintaining them? And the quote from the second Union 2 there illustrates the problem. Great, we've got all these members in bargaining. Now what do we do with them? Because now they want our services. So then where's the room to go and organise new members when these are the conditions and circumstances that the unions experience? So in terms of experimentation, what sort of choices do both of the unions have? And when we look at Union 1, that was the union that had one organiser in the not-for-profit sector and 6 in the public sector. We start to think about what the organisers themselves know about their membership. And so this person says, we've got to be looking at migration, and really that's an issue about language. Where are the language groups? How are we going to employ people from those language groups, those church groups, those sporting groups, to find the new members? So quite an innovative action and thought process by an organiser who is close to the members. But then we sort of go back to the second comment here reflects the people that are in the public sector. So that the organised sector, who have had successful strike actions over decades because they have been organised for decades, and they have paid time release if they're going to go on strike. So, but if they don't get paid time release, they get paid for their hours that are striking, well then they're not going to go and do it, and they're not going to go and help anyone else do it either. So they won't go out on strike on behalf of the not-for-profit sector workers. So there's a partial level of experimentation by this union to try and organise these workers. They recognise some changes need to be made, but there's still a little bit of a political blockage around how the union functions with the public service members. And what about the second union? Again, we can see some seeds of experimentation there. They can, in terms of if we go back to the lock-in, that sort of cognitive and political approaches to maintaining current systems. We see here in this first quote, the piece that I've highlighted there, that this organiser sees that acts of social movement unionism beyond just simply arguing for industrial rights, but looking at other broader social issues is something that can be used to draw members in. So beyond just simply just those constant arguments for terms and conditions of employment and wages, these are of course important, but what other campaigns will unions get involved in? And then again, we see that little bit of a blockage there in terms of the institution, the union as an institution. So we're talking about workload, and of course we all know about workload. It takes, for many of us, it takes a lot of time away from what we need to do. And so this organiser is saying, yes, we can go out and get service people, but then there are just constantly putting out fires. And that goes back to that point really around, we organise these people in bargaining, and then they come to us with grievances, disputes. They could be getting sacked, they could be have a workplace harassment charge or a discipline meeting, experiencing that. So you have to go and deal with management, etc. So we have some, as I said, some seeds of experimentation, but still a little bit of way to go. So getting back to that very first question of where was that expletive list of members, how are we going to organise them, where do we find them? Well, what can unions do if we think about reshaping, recomposing how unions think about themselves in terms of organisational and institutional experimentation? So when we're talking about organisational experimentation, it's the social actors. So in this case, the trade union organisers. They know their members. They can see that there are opportunities for the union as an institution to change the way they address members by going out to perhaps community groups to find the list, or to the church group to find the list, or the sporting club or the swimming club or whatever it might be. So there's some hope there. And then when we think about the unions as institutions and thinking about some of those, the embedded nature of those political and institutional relationships, you know, we have some uneven findings, evidence there about whether unions really can reconstitute themselves, break away from those structures that are very comfortable, that served the unions for a very long period of time, but possibly aren't really appropriate for contemporary union organising. So really the question still remains for us, you know, can institutions change to sufficiently try new ways of bargaining? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.